Okay.
Good evening, everyone. We'll give everyone just a second to join. And we'll wait just another minute or two for everyone to join. All right, it's about 4 after, so I'm going to go ahead and get started. So good evening, everyone, and welcome tonight to Urgent Archives, Memory and Justice. My name is Tiffany Mullman, and I am the faculty affiliate of the Roberson Project on Slavery, Race, and Reconciliation here at Sewanee. I am also a member of the History Department and a public historian. And tonight it is my pleasure to introduce our speaker, Dr. Michelle Caswell. First, I would like to say a few words of thanks to the people and organizations helping to fund tonight's event. This event is part of a larger initiative of the Roberson Project. The Roberson Project recently received 2 very generous grants that support an inter-campus collaborative project in community-driven archiving. One is a Legacies of American Slavery grant from the Council of Independent Colleges and the Gilder Lehrman Center for the study of slavery, resistance, and abolition at Yale University. This supports programming that, among other things, seeks to address and redress the Jim Crow condition of institutional and other archives as a persistent and powerful legacy of American slavery. The other grant, from the Associated Colleges of the South, supports innovative curricular development that directly addresses campus diversity and inclusion. Both grants were funded by the Mellon Foundation. And so now about our speaker, Dr. Michelle Caswell. Dr. Caswell is an associate professor of archival studies in the Department of Information Studies at the University of California, Los Angeles. Caswell directs a team of students at UCLA's Community Archives Lab, which explores the ways that independent, identity-based memory organizations document, shape, and provide access to the histories of minoritized communities, with a particular emphasis on understanding their effective political and artistic impact. In 2008, together with Samit Malik, Caswell co-founded the South Asian American Digital Archive, an online repository that documents and provides access to the stories of South Asian Americans. She's the author of the books Urgent Archives, enacting liberatory memory work, and archiving the unspeakable, silence, memory, and the photographic record in Cambodia, as well as dozens of peer-reviewed articles and critical archival studies. Tonight, Dr. Caswell will speak to us on the subject of urgent archives, memory, and justice, sharing a disruptive critique of dominant Western narratives about the aims and purposes of historical archives. We are asking that you put any questions into the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen. I am excited to have her here, so please welcome Dr. Michelle Caswell.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that introduction, Professor Mullman. Thank you so much, Professor Register, also for inviting me. I'm just absolutely delighted to be here today. And I join you today from UCLA, which is on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Gabrielino Tongva peoples. I'm going to share my screen right now. I have some slides to share with all of you. Great, fantastic. So today I'm going to be talking to you about urgent archives enacting liberatory memory work. And this talk is based on my book of the same title, which just came out in May from Routledge Press. So I'm here to talk to you today about archives. And I think many people either don't think of archives at all, or when they do think of archives, they think of them as like stodgy, dusty, dead, elitist white spaces for the suede elbows on a tweed coat crowd. And that is because the dominant Western archival profession has done a terrible job, I think, at bringing the public in and at welcoming them and at activating traces of the past in their care for contemporary activism. Today, I want to introduce you to you a different world, a world of possibility, a world where archives of all kinds, those affiliated with academic institutions, government repositories, and also independent community-based archives, are activated urgently for contemporary activism against white supremacy, heteropatriarchy, and other forms of oppression. I think first we really need to look at independent community-based archives for some inspiration about how to do this. I think they do amazing work that can really guide us all. But before I get there, I want to situate myself. So I'm both a scholar of archival studies and a co-founder of a community-based archives called the South Asian American Digital Archive, or SATA. So on the one hand, I'm caught up in the world of research and publications and teaching as a professor. And on the other hand, I'm caught up in the micro world of removing staples and scanning and creating metadata, and the macro world of dealing with donors and writing grant proposals and setting organizational procedure and direction. So I wear all of those hats today. And for me, my two roles are inseparable. My research informs my practice, and my practice informs my research. And as a scholar of archival studies, I feel it's important to define what archival studies is, right? Because many people have not heard of it. So archival studies is a subfield of information studies that is interested in examining records as potential evidence of human activity that travel across space and time. I sit at the cusp of social science and humanities. So I both collect empirical data to answer questions about what is, and then I think critically and analytically about what should be. And so you'll see both of those approaches also reflected in my talk today. But even above my role as scholar, as an archivist, I'm a person, and I bring my full self to my work. So I wanted to introduce myself just a little bit before I get started. So I'm a working class white woman from Chicago. Neither of my parents graduated from high school. At a very early age, I was bused from my white neighborhood to desegregated schools, majority Black schools on the south side of the city. In junior high and high school, I walked by this mural every day. And I apologize that the photo is cut and pasted together, but it actually matches how I kind of see it in my memory. So I walked by this mural every day on the way to the cafeteria. This mural is a really powerful memory and a really powerful force for me. The mural connects Black and Indigenous histories. I quickly learned, even in 7th grade, that white people like myself were responsible for the theft and dispossession that were described in this mural. As an 11-year-old, I really tried to place myself in this picture. And it's hard to see in the slide, but on the left-hand side, under the in the middle, where after the last time it says land, it says, "We are going to be free again." And I remember thinking, what does that mean? Who is the we? What is free? And what is again, right? And so this caused me to start thinking about time a lot, right? Even though I didn't have the vocabulary for it at that point in time, right? And I really, after walking by this mural every day for 6 years, had the realization, right, that our histories are bound together. Your history is bound in mine. Your freedom is bound in my freedom. And so this mural, again, really had an impact on me that I bring with me to this day. So thanks to reading scholarship in Black studies, I began to think differently and think differently about white supremacy, right? So, you know, the dominant definitions of white supremacy about white supremacy being just for the Klan are inaccurate. It's a much more pervasive, insidious force. I left Chicago, graduated high school, and attended Columbia University in New York for college. The core curriculum at Columbia is a white supremacist curriculum. It's 2 years of multiple set books that are all written by rich white men. A few years ago, they just added Toni Morrison, who's the first Black woman, to the core curriculum. So what does it mean when your college thinks that there's nothing necessary or nothing you need to know by Black women? I remember thinking, where was I as a working class white girl in the curriculum? And where were my Black friends from high school in that curriculum? Where were the people in this mural in that curriculum? According to Columbia's core curriculum, right, we did not exist. Even though I have to admit, of course, that my whiteness held out a possibility of belonging if only I could overcome my working class roots. So fast forward decades later, I'm working as the assistant bibliographer for South Asia at the University of Chicago Libraries. And I had the great fortune of meeting Samit Malik, who is a force of nature. He's a child of immigrants from India and is now the executive director of Sata. But at that point in time, before Sata had even been conceived, Samit asked me who's collecting records documenting the history of South Asians in the US. And I had actually done an independent study research project in my Master's of Library and Information Studies program to ask that question. And the answer was no one. And Samit, being a force of nature, said, let's do it, right? So we just incorporated as a nonprofit. We each pitched in $100 to buy some server space. Samit has a bachelor's degree in computer science, so he had all of the technical skills needed to do this. We wrote a collection development policy. We enlisted our friends to serve as a board of directors, and we started Sata. We directly challenged all of those at the time who told us that community archives didn't exist or that they're not legitimate. And that still happens occasionally to this day. We're told that community archives are not legitimate, but thankfully, that has changed quite a bit, and that is happening with a lot less frequency than it did 12, 13 years ago when we first started. So Sata is what we call a post-custodial online-only community-based archive. When I say it's post-custodial, it means that rather than accept physical custody of materials like most archives do, we borrow them from individuals, from families, from organizations, and from archives. We digitize them, we describe them using culturally appropriate language, and then we return them. And then we make them freely accessible online. So, and we're an independent organization. We're not affiliated with a university or another archival repository. So I should clarify what I mean when I say community archives. So diverging from centuries of archival thinking about government and bureaucratic records, the past decade has seen the rapid expansion of inquiries into what we now call community archives. The first attempts to describe community archives emerged from the UK. So writing in 2009, Andrew Flynn, Mary Stevens, and Elizabeth Shepard write, a community is any group of people who come together and present themselves as such, and a community archive is the product of their attempts to document the history of their commonality. And then they write further, the defining characteristic of community archives is the active participation of a community in documenting and making accessible their history on their own terms. And that's highlighted, on their own terms, right? Because that's the most important part, I think, of the definition. So I think this is a great first take at a definition, but I also think it requires some refinement in our current context. More specifically, I think we can't discuss the phenomenon of community archives in the US without addressing power and inequity. So here, I think we can broadly divide community archives into two categories: those that represent and serve dominant communities, such as historical societies, that some of which, not all of which, but some of which are often invested in white supremacist histories as a way to maintain or increase local property values. And by contrast, those that serve and represent underrepresented, marginalized, or oppressed minoritized communities. And it's this later group of community archives that I'm interested in and that I think has developed really liberatory theories and practices that we can all learn from. So we might call these archives specifically minoritized identity-based community archives, in which the history held in common coalesces around a shared history of oppression, right? Be it white supremacy, heteropatriarchy, colonialism, capitalism, ableism, and their complex intersections. Furthermore, I think it's important to distinguish independent community archives from what we might call community-driven or community-accountable collecting projects located within dominant institutions, and we can discuss why later. So to be absolutely clear, when I say community archives, I mean independent, minoritized, identity-based community archives, which is clunky and doesn't really translate into a nice acronym. So my previous work has addressed the ways in which these minoritized identity-based community archives counter what we call the symbolic annihilation of oppressed communities. That is the ways that predominantly white university and government archives have underrepresented, misrepresented, or completely ignored communities of color and LGBTQ+ communities. I've posited that community archives counter symbolic annihilation with what I call representational belonging, empowering people who have been marginalized by mainstream media outlets and memory institutions to have the autonomy and authority to establish, enact, and reflect on their presence in ways that are complex, meaningful, substantive, and positive in a variety of symbolic contexts, including archives. So this presentation will build on and also go beyond my previous work using recent projects by Sata to get the conversation going. So more specifically, I'll address the relationship between liberatory appraisal and liberatory outreach in community archives, arguing that community archives should build on recuperative and representational collecting initiatives to activate records to stop cycles of oppression. I'll introduce a new concept, corollary records, to show how records from similar moments in history can be activated in the present. I'll also argue that more robust and accurate representation of minoritized communities is a limited and limiting end goal for archives, however important it is. I argue that community archives must aim for more than representation, leveraging the minoritized histories they have painstakingly recuperated for liberatory ends. Through strategic outreach with artists, activists, and other community members, archivists can ensure the records in their care are activated to stop oppression in the present. Ultimately, I argue that community archives must pair liberatory appraisal with liberatory activation in order to resist the white temporal imaginary. And another point of clarification before I get to my examples here is that although this talk draws on my experience as a co-founder and volunteer for Sata, I've not directly worked on the main projects discussed herein, other than digitizing some of the collections from which the projects draw and providing some very general feedback. That said, I'm in constant conversation with Sata's executive director, Samit Malik, and I often provide informal advice on project ideas and implementation. So as such, I can't claim to stand entirely apart from the work addressed in this talk. I make no assertions of being an outside researcher, though I am certainly a white outsider to the South Asian American community. But rather, I'm also an integral component of the phenomenon, community archives, that my work is describing in a manner that I think is consistent with participant observation as a research method. I also can't claim ownership or take credit for most of the archival labor described in this talk, and shift from using we to they pronouns in discussing the work of Sata and Sata staff when appropriate. So with all of those caveats and introduction, let's get started with Sata. So speaking at a July 2020 community-wide open Zoom meeting, Sata Executive Director Samit Malik said, quote, "As an organization, even though we are thinking about and engaging with the past, our work has really always been about the present, the now," end quote. The meeting was called by Malik in the midst of 3 intertwined crises: a global pandemic that has disproportionately devastated Black, Latinx, and Indigenous communities, the ongoing state-sanctioned murder of Black Americans brought to the fore by the murder of George Floyd, and at that point in time, inept, malfeasant white supremacist national leadership in the White House. Samip said, "We have some good news to share in the midst of this challenging time," in the invitation he sent out for this event. And I think we all were eager to get some good news at that point in time. So that meeting in July 2020 was an opportunity to celebrate the organization's 12th birthday, to announce a new grant from the Mellon Foundation. You can see the Mellon Foundation is a common thread in much of our work here, that would help support the organization for the next 2 years, and to launch a fundraising campaign with supporters. It was also an opportunity to demonstrate the archive's value by drawing on corollary moments from the community's past to make sense of the seemingly senseless and increasingly overwhelming present. At that moment, that meant activating records in Sata's collections to inspire action around the movement for Black lives and, at that point, the upcoming 2020 election. So after inviting attendees of the community meeting to participate in a pandemic documentation project, which I can talk more about if you're interested in the Q&A, that's its own separate talk. Malik then pivoted to the other crisis on everyone's minds, the proliferation of and impunity for state-sponsored violence against Black people. South Asian Americans have a complicated history with the American racial hierarchy, as many records in Sata can attest. Some early immigrants from India aligned themselves with whiteness to varying degrees of success, while others passed as Black. The 1965 Hart-Celler Immigration and Nationality Act that enabled South Asians to immigrate to the United States in larger numbers would not have been possible without the civil rights movement. Yet anti-Black racism remains an ongoing problem within the community, despite the efforts of many South Asian American activists, many of whom are involved with Sata. So for Samip, Malik, that meeting was also an opportunity to further position Sata as an organization committed to justice for Black people. Acknowledging the complexity of these histories, he drew connections between the ongoing movement for Black lives and corollary moments in history in which South Asian Americans were involved in activism for Black liberation. Yet he also directly confronted anti-Black racism within the community and did not gloss over its history of aspirational misalignment with whiteness. Quote, "In response to the murder of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, and too many others, we are sharing stories from our community's past that help engage our community today in the struggle against anti-Black racism," he said. He then recounted the story of H.G. Mudgall, an Indian immigrant to Harlem in the 1920s, who became the editor of Marcus Garvey's newspaper and an outspoken activist for Black independence. Malik said, quote, "H.G. Mudgall's story is a reminder both of the historical possibilities and duties for South Asians to engage in solidarity with Black communities, but moreover, the urgency now for us to engage in those solidarities and to address anti-Blackness within our own communities," end quote. So Malik's comments reflect a temporality of urgency in which records from the past are invoked to inspire contemporary political action. In this way, the 1920s are set up as a corollary moment to the 2020s, and records documenting H.G. Mudgall from the 1920s are set up as corollary records to those being created by South Asian American activists fighting anti-Black racism now. By catalyzing corollary records from corollary moments, Malik showed precedent for South Asian American solidarity with Black Americans, evoking what he called historical possibilities that align the community with the contemporary movement for Black lives. These activations, I think, forge a cyclical temporality that dispenses with the racial progress narratives of white time. Instead of insisting that it gets better for minoritized communities, these efforts show how oppressive histories repeat, how historical possibilities can be invoked to forge affinities and solidarities in the present, how a precedent of anti-racist activism can inspire action for Black lives in the now. In this work, archives become urgently relevant and crucially contemporary. The current moment demands more from archives than simply documenting these stories of solidarity in hopes some future users might find them. Sata catalyzes these records into action to forge corollary moments across cycles of time and to create a temporality of urgency for the community it serves and represents. Malik's final announcement at that meeting also conveyed the urgency of the past by forging yet another corollary moment with the present. Looking ahead at that point in time, ahead to the November 2020 US presidential election, Malik discussed a video Sata produced in May 2020 featuring a woman named Rani Bagai, whose grandparents, Vaishno Das and Kala Bagai, were among the first immigrants from India to the US, arriving in 1915. I had the pleasure of documenting that collection, and it's digitizing that collection, I should say. And it's just an immense pleasure to see the collection be activated in this way. I'm going to play for you now a 2.5-minute video clip about this collection. So I'll stop sharing that screen and share another screen. If I can find it. Hold on. Here we go. So this is a video that Sata produced in May 2020.
Why does your vote matter? Well, allow me to tell you a story. This is my family. My grandparents came here in search of a better life for themselves and their 3 sons, including my dad. They arrived in San Francisco just over 100 years ago in 1915, but it was a time of xenophobia and racism, particularly against those from South Asia, like my family. Shortly after my grandparents arrived, Congress passed a new law banning South Asians from coming to the US. But my grandparents were lucky. They were here together. They bought a home and started a business. In 1921, my grandfather even achieved his dream and became an American citizen. But just 2 years later, his dream was shattered. In 1923, the Supreme Court made it illegal for South Asians to be American citizens. My grandfather's citizenship was nullified, and he was left without a country to call his own. This destroyed him, and sadly, a few years later, he took his own life. In a letter he left behind, he wrote, "I came to America thinking, dreaming, and hoping to make this land my home. I established myself and tried to give my children the best American education. But they now say I am no longer an American citizen. Now, what am I? What have I made of myself and my children? We cannot exercise our rights. Is life worth living in a gilded cage?" It was more than 20 years later before the laws were changed, and South Asians, including my dad and my grandmother, could finally apply for American citizenship. This is why voting matters. I hope my family's story is a reminder of what we've endured to get the rights we have now, how easily they can be taken away, and how hard it is to win them back. If you haven't yet, please register to vote right now. And please, please vote in November.
I'll stop sharing that slide and go back to my PowerPoint slides. There we go. So in that brief video, Rani Bagai articulated a cyclical temporality, later echoed by Malik at that community meeting, that refuses the logic of white racial progress narratives. Progress is not a given. The granting of an ever-increasing number of rights is not inevitable, right? Rather, these messages communicate South Asian Americans did not always have rights. Their ancestors fought for them. They could be rescinded. We might need to fight for them again, right? Oppressive histories repeat themselves. The threat of this repetition looms large. In just 2 minutes, I think this video counters white temporalities that assume the inevitability and desirability of a just post-racial future. Instead, we see a community weathering repeated attacks throughout history and using traces of the past to ward off the next attack in the present, drawing on records from corollary moments, in this case, the 1923 dismantling of citizenship rights for Indian immigrants, to catalyze voter registration in 2020. So again, there's a temporal urgency here to the past and to archival activations of the past. So in these cases, Sata is drawing on what I call corollary records from corollary moments to catalyze political consciousness and action in the now. Corollary records document reoccurring moments in time in which the same or similar oppressions get repeated. A corollary moment is a point in time with historical precedence. At their most useful, records can be activated in corollary moments in the present so that community members can learn activist tactics and strategies, see what worked, what didn't work, and get inspiration to keep going. So quote, we've been here before, we've survived this before, we've resisted before. Corollary records assert, if they could speak. Here's how. By activating corollary records, Sata's community members are, if only for a second, interrupting reoccurring oppressions by learning from previous generations of community members facing corollary moments. And this is one way I think that archives can help dismantle systemic oppression and engage in liberatory memory work by catalyzing the activation of corollary records in the past to inspire and strategize activism in the present. So these examples mark an important shift for Sata, a movement from collecting records for what I would say were recuperative and representational purposes to what I call a form of liberatory appraisal, towards using and encouraging others to use those records against oppression in what I call liberatory activation of records. So in the initial years of working with Sata 12, 13 years ago, Malik, other volunteers, and I were stunned with the amount of materials we found that dated back before 1965, when US immigration law changed to enable greater numbers of South Asians in the US. Back in 2008, when we first founded Sata, we had read about California's early Punjabi Mexican communities and heard rumors about a few anti-colonial activists along the west coast of the US and Canada from the turn of the 20th century. But we had no idea, honestly, the wealth of records we would find once we really started to look. So we feverishly collected as many pre-1965 records as we could, thrilled to fill in some gaps and silences. I would say these initial aims were recuperative in the sense that we were trying to recuperate lost histories, to pull them back from oblivion into the community's consciousness. Our work was also representational in the sense that we were trying to increase the amount and types of representations of South Asians in US stories about the past. Recuperative and representational collecting kept us busy for nearly a decade, and guided by a broad appraisal policy, we discovered and digitized more than we had ever anticipated about South Asian American history. So I characterize these initial recuperative and representational collecting impulses as forms of liberatory appraisal. So appraisal is not how you assign monetary value to things as it's generally used. But in the archival world, appraisal is the process by which you assign evidentiary value to collections of materials. It's how you decide what to keep and what to get rid of, right? How you decide what is archival, what falls within scope, and what gets collected, but also what gets excluded, right? Appraisal theory has preoccupied archival studies for centuries, resulting in a host of theories, strategies, and tactics archivists employ to make appraisal decisions, including notions of primary and secondary value, functional analyses, documentation strategy. I can really geek out about appraisal theory if there are any archivists who want to do that with me. Recently, I've proposed feminist standpoint appraisal as a type of liberatory appraisal that acknowledges the positionality of the appraiser and seeks to center the needs of those most disempowered due to the interlocking oppressions of white supremacy and heteropatriarchy. In placing value on materials created by minoritized communities, in appraising them as worthy of retention and preservation, and in thinking about the emotional, material, and political consequences of such decisions on the communities represented in such records, archivists engaged in representational and recuperative collecting can be said, I think, to engage in liberatory appraisal. Still, for Sata staff and communities, representing more Brown people in US history has never been enough. For years, Malik and community members have discussed how, if the archives only collected the records of the most prominent South Asian Americans, the collection would replicate the same forms of erasure it sought to combat. So what good would a South Asian American archives be if it only validated the experiences of straight, cis, upper caste, rich men, right? Over the years, it became increasingly clear that for Sata's collection to be inclusive of those most minoritized within South Asian American communities, we'd have to think outside of the box of dominant Western archival appraisal. catalyzing the creation of new records rather than just searching for pre-existing records to digitize. So in 2019, with support from the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation, Sata launched the Archival Creators Fellowship Program, which in its first round partnered with 3 fellows to create archival collections that reflect the histories and perspectives of some of the most marginalized groups within South Asian American communities. So Dalit women, Indo-Guyanese immigrants, and queer and trans people. Sata is now in the second round with 6 new fellows and is just accepting applications right now for the next round of fellows. The project reveals how, in the absence of robust pre-existing documentation, recuperation alone is not enough. While it's crucial to catalyze the generation of new records that fill in gaps, in order to truly center minoritized communities, archives must also respect silences, resist surveillance, and honor consent as an ongoing relational process rather than just a one-time transaction. And this will mean changing commonly accepted practices and policies in the dominant Western archival world. So our initial twin impulses of recuperation and representation were motivated, but by what I would later come to describe as symbolic annihilation, the symbolic annihilation of South Asian Americans, replacing that symbolic annihilation with feelings of representational belonging. So by finding, digitizing, providing access to as many records documenting the early history of South Asian Americans as we could, we were countering the symbolic annihilation with a powerful assertion of existence. We were here, right, and belonging. And clearly, experiences of seeing yourself and your community in history after being excluded or misrepresented due to racism and or heteropatriarchy are emotionally powerful. Nearly every interview and focus group I've conducted with volunteers, staff, users of, and donors to minoritized community-based archives over the past 10 years confirm the emotional impact of robust representation after repeated and extended experiences of symbolic annihilation in mainstream archives. So this emotional impact, archives provoking a feeling of self-recognition in minoritized communities, can be an important emotional element of liberation, right? It's joyous to see yourself represented after feeling symbolically annihilated. And that joy is inherently political in a system designed to oppress. And I don't in any way mean to downplay how important that feeling of self-recognition is. But symbolic annihilation and actual annihilation are intimately related. So symbolic annihilation both precedes and succeeds actual annihilation, such that individuals and communities are rendered expendable, invisible, or non-existent before they are subject to violence, particularly state-sanctioned violence. And then after violence, such murderous acts are often rendered invisible or expunged from the record, magnifying and mimicking the violence itself. Every dehumanizing misrepresentation in archives that says, quote, "you are not quite human," and every archival absence that says, quote, "you are not important enough to collect," adds up to create the conditions that enable mass murder and or genocide to occur. And then after such violence happens, every dehumanizing misrepresentation of that violence in archives that says, quote, "you deserved it anyway," and every archival absence of that violence that says, quote, "your death is not even important enough to note," also adds up to the conditions that justify mass murder or genocide, that grant impunity for it and enable it to occur again, right? Setting up us all up for the fall next time as this keeps reoccurring. So given this link between symbolic and actual annihilation, any discussion of liberatory archives must assert the importance of robust representation and recuperative collecting. Liberatory appraisal strategies such as these seek to center oppressed positionalities by assigning archival value based on the needs of oppressed communities. These needs may include valuing records for evidentiary purposes, as in the case of potential legal redress, or for effective or emotional purposes in the case of countering symbolic annihilation with representational belonging. But I think we need to go further, right? Representation cannot be the only or ultimate goal of liberatory memory work. And I want to give you a concrete example. So in 2019, 2 amazing Berkeley activists, Barnali Ghosh and Anirvan Chatterjee, successfully began a campaign to get a street in downtown Berkeley named after Kala Bagai, Rani Bagai's grandmother, who you just saw in the video. We think it's one of the very few, if not the only, street named after a South Asian American woman in the United States. It's an amazing and joyous act to watch South Asian Americans recognize themselves in this official street sign, as I saw this summer. So Kalabagai Way is now the final stop on the Berkeley Radical South Asian History Walking Tour, which is organized by Ghosh and Chatterjee, the two activists that I discussed. It's absolutely important to rename our streets in honor of BIPOC women, 100%. But let's not stop there, as I think Ghosh and Chatterjee would agree. Let's also activate records to abolish policing as we know it on that corner, right? To end white supremacy and heteropatriarchy on that corner. These symbols are important, but we have to do more than just change symbols. Let's make Kalabagai Way a liberated zone, not just in name, but in practice. Again, as someone who worked on digitizing this collection, it's awesome to see the records that I digitized, scanned alone at night in my office be activated in this way, right? Be activated to rename a street. But too often recuperative collecting projects fall into a trap of respectability that is ultimately counter to the aims of liberation. So a politics of respectability insists on collecting records that conform to dominant expectations about what a minoritized community should be. This is true of many university-led projects that seek to recuperate the history of minoritized communities by documenting their prominent firsts, right? The first politician, the first business leader, the first actor. Such collections, whether they're in dominant or community-led archives, are about inclusion within oppressive structures rather than about liberation from them. And I think often they pander to dominant groups instead of resisting that domination. Given this complexity, more representational collecting is not necessarily the result of liberatory appraisal, but it can be. Recuperative and representational collecting can be liberatory appraisal strategies if they're part of a larger liberatory project. Thus, liberatory appraisal is the process of determining the value of records in regard to their potential activation for liberation struggles. Contrary to the past century of dominant Western appraisal theory, liberatory appraisal considers the potential uses of records in making appraisal decisions and further asks whose uses and for what aims. In this sense, liberatory appraisal is intimately tied to liberatory outreach, as it's only in the activation of the records that their full liberatory potential can be realized. So its undergirding assumption is that archives can catalyze particular kinds of use, whether it's political use, artistic use, activist use, by modeling that use in their own practices and by targeting outreach efforts to groups engaged in liberatory work. So my argument here echoes, but also complicates an argument made by the brilliant archivist turned anthropologist, Jarrett Drake, in a 2018 blog post. So questioning any easy notion of community in the term community archives, Drake writes, quote, archivists must shift their paradigms away from the fictive notions of local and community-based towards a more radically precise and politically liberatory language, end quote. Drake identifies the ways that community can be invoked as a euphemism to talk about minoritized people without a power analysis. That is, without addressing the oppressive systems that minoritize them in the first place. So I have frequently witnessed the phenomenon Drake describes, particularly regarding self-described community-based collections at university repositories, in which predominantly white institutions often extract materials from BIPOC communities in ways that actually replicate or reinforce white supremacy rather than interrogate or dismantle it, right? Community archives, it's become increasingly clear to me, must leverage the recuperative and representational imperatives to activate corollary records across corollary moments in the present for liberation from oppressive systems. The work of archives and the work of activism, the work of representation and the work of liberation cannot occur on separate but parallel tracks. They must be intertwined. So liberatory activation describes those interventions in and uses of records that seek to dismantle systems of oppression and imagine and enact new possible worlds. It's not enough for archival institutions to collect these records with a vague notion of some potential future use. The records must be activated right now for activist struggles now. Building archives around an acknowledgement of cyclical fluctuations in oppression and corresponding fluctuations in the desire, need, and ability to be recorded and archived is a direct challenge to the white temporalities on which dominant Western archival theory is based. As I go into detail in my book, dominant Western archival theory fixes records in space and time, relying on a white temporal imaginary that posits time both as linear and progressive, that past precedes the present presages the future, and assumes that social conditions get better over time. I want to think a little bit about the word capture. So archivists talk a lot about capturing records, and that is such an uncomfortable word. And I want to sit in that discomfort because I think there's a reason why we're uncomfortable with it. It's because it echoes oppressive, extractive practices. So we need to pause whenever we hear that word capture, I think, in relation to records or anything else. In contrast, Sata, like other community archives, I think reflects a cyclical rather than linear temporality in which it's acknowledged oppression repeats and that records invoke these corollary moments in the past and present, and records are collected in order to be activated right now, right? In a cyclical temporality in which oppressive history repeats, the need, desire, and ability to be represented in archive fluctuates over time. The temporal and affective or emotional aspects of liberatory memory work, I think, are little more than hollow gestures without attention to the material aspects. So representation in archives must be paired with redistribution of resources, I think, to bring about meaningful change. And here I identify two critical components of material redistribution that I think are key for liberatory memory work: redistribution of resources in society writ large, and in the archival world specifically. In the American context, liberatory memory work must support the activation of records for reparations for Black people and land reclamation for Indigenous people. Focusing more narrowly on archival practice, which is my realm, right? Liberatory memory work must support, I think, the redistribution of resources from well-endowed, predominantly white elitist institutions to chronically underfunded community archives that serve and represent minoritized communities. So in 2016, I had the great fortune of being part of a group of 3 American memory workers, pictured here. Jarrett Drake, who I have already mentioned, and the now late and dearly missed historian and activist Doria Johnson, who formed a delegation to participate in the Nelson Mandela Center's International Dialogue Series on how to use memory for justice in post-conflict societies. So participation in the series posed a temporal challenge for us as Americans. How do you relate to memory workers in post-conflict societies when you come from a society which is not only not post-conflict, but fully in the midst of a 500-year-old conflict in which, at least in 2016, most white Americans didn't even acknowledge as existing? So it became nearly impossible for the 3 of us to relate to our colleagues from places like Bosnia, Rwanda, Argentina, places where there had been a clear break, right? A regime change, an official reversal of policy, followed by a public accounting for crimes, and to varying degrees, a formal mechanism for reparation or redistribution or justice of some sort. I'm not claiming that those mechanisms have been successful in those other places. To reflect on this disorienting experience, the 3 of us co-authored an essay that advocates for what we call a liberation theology for memory work. And this brief essay really helped us make sense of our experiences and laid the groundwork for this talk and my thinking ever since by outlining the temporal, emotional, and material concerns of liberatory memory work. So I'll read you here, a quote from this essay. "The past was never singular, nor will the future be. In order to generate these futures, memory work should be dangerous. It should seek not only to acknowledge past trauma, but to repair it. It should aim to upend hierarchies of power, to distribute resources more equitably, to enable complex forms of self-representation, and to restore the humanity of those for whom it has been denied." From end quote. This frames the stakes of liberatory memory work, extending the boundaries of such work well beyond formal sites of knowledge production and transmission, such as archives, libraries, museums, universities. What's at stake ultimately is not just how we remember the past, but how we distribute power, its temporal, emotional, and material instantiations in the present. After this general outlining of the stakes of liberatory memory work, we then specified what this means for US memory workers. And we wrote, and I'm going to quote this at length, quote, "In our immediate context, in the wake of a disastrous American election," this was in 2016, "liberatory memory work means using our skills as archivists, public historians, and academics to end the state-sponsored murder and mass incarceration of Black people and the continued genocide and displacement of Indigenous peoples, to dismantle systems of white supremacy, to actively resist the oppression of the most vulnerable amongst us, and to re-envision forms of justice that repair and restore rather than violate and harm individuals and communities," end quote. Herein, I think, lies the tangible material answer for the question of what liberatory memory work can accomplish. Nothing less than the redistribution of wealth and land in support of Black and Indigenous liberation struggles. Memory workers, and archivists in particular, can take a lead role in the movement for material reparations for the descendants of enslaved Africans in the US. There is much debate about what forms these reparations might take, and I don't want to go into too much detail about that. I don't think that's for me to really determine, including direct cash payments to the descendants of Africans enslaved in the US. As several prison abolitionists have made clear, the deep connections between enslavement and the ongoing scourge of police violence and mass incarceration, any movement towards the connections between enslavement and police violence and mass incarceration, any movement towards material reparation for Black Americans must be linked to dismantling the police and the prison industrial complex to have lasting liberatory consequences, I think. So if archivists think outside of the confines of neutrality and the constraints of professionalism, we have a really important role to play in this struggle, right? Archivists are experts on records. We can use our expertise in records to communicate their potential and their shortcomings, what got recorded and what did not, and why. We can activate the records in our care in support of efforts towards material reparations. We can provide space for descendants of enslaved people to publicize their legal claims for reparations, as archivists at Shift Design and the Texas After Violence Project did in 2019 in a public conversation with Tamara Lanier, who is suing Harvard University for ownership of daguerreotypes taken of her enslaved ancestors, which is a fascinating story. I highly recommend doing some reading about that. If we're employed by institutions with such oppressive policies and procedures, we can refuse to abide by them and make our refusals public. We can also describe the records that we do have in ways that aid descendants in making legal claims. We can mobilize the records in our care regarding previous successful claims to reparation to show that material reparations are not unrealistic dreams, but have historical precedent, have corollary moments, right? So Nazi records were used to figure out which Holocaust survivors were entitled to payment from the German Claims Conference. US government records were used to figure out which Japanese Americans were incarcerated during World War II and entitled to a cash payment. And Cambodian archivists have activated records in their care to both convince UN officials to launch a tribunal against the Khmer Rouge and to provide evidence to convict Khmer Rouge officials of genocide. So archivists have done this kind of work before, and we can do it again and on a larger scale in the US. So I wanted to add to these imperatives before I close a more specific demand for material redistribution as it pertains to the funding of archives. I think we need a redistribution of resources away from large, predominantly white cultural institutions towards community-based archives representing and serving minoritized communities. As Burgess Jules has noted, foundations, government agencies, and high net worth individual donors have all until very recently excluded community archives from the funding sources on which mainstream museums and archives rely. White supremacy, as evidenced in extended divestment from the community served and represented by community archives, extractive relationships with universities, and the biases of funding agencies have all caused the chronic underfunding of community archives. Meanwhile, funding structures based on the logics of capitalism and white supremacy have resulted in an overinvestment in predominantly white cultural institutions that house dominant mainstream archives. For example, I've seen an LA-based community archives launch a life-changing exhibition on an annual budget of $12,000 a year, organized by an army of volunteers, while across town, in an hour or so of traffic, depending on the time of day, The Getty Center in Brentwood spends millions conserving every last trace of white male detritus that very few, if any, people will ever touch by design, right? It's by design that very few people will ever touch it. Decisions about what to keep, how to describe it, how to activate it should not be made solely by hyper-educated white people walled up in a white marble fortress in the hills of Brentwood. The BIPOC and LGBTQ+ communities that sustain community archives should have access to the same amount and sources of funding to make autonomous decisions about their own materials. The impact of such a reallocation would be astounding, I think, as community archives would be able to pay for dedicated staff and infrastructure, extending their scope and reach well beyond our current imaginations. So in closing, I want to end with kind of a dreamy question, which is, I think about liberatory memory work and its demands of us as being temporal, right? So they change our sense of time, emotional, we have an emotional reaction, and most importantly, material shifts. And I want us to think a little bit about how we're stuck. We might feel stuck in our current environment and not be constrained by that. I want us to ask, what if? What if archivists let go of the oppressive concepts and systems and structures we've inherited as a profession and imagine a new way of doing things? What if white archivists, myself amongst us, committed to being race traders, to abolishing white supremacy in all of its manifestations and archival practice? What if historians, scholars, and community members of all kinds used archives, not just for more robust representation, but as tools for human liberation? What if we asserted, to refer back to that mural that I walked by every day between 7th and 12th grade from my high school, what if we asserted we are going to be free again? And then what if we activated archives to do that, to be free again? I have high hopes for us and lots of pressures for all of us to do that. So I will close there. I'll stop sharing my screen. And I think we have some time for questions.
Thank you, Dr. Caswell. I took so many notes, I think my hand hurts, but thank you so much for that presentation. And I want to turn the floor over for questions. If you have questions, please feel free to drop them in the Q&A box that you can find at the bottom of the screen.
It's a strange experience just talking to yourself, to your own computer screen for an hour. So I'm like happy to see your face again. At a certain point in the talk, I thought, what if it's not actually working? I would have no way of knowing. I was just speaking to myself. So.
As the questions come in, I have a question.
Okay, please.
I was wondering if you could go over your definition of liberatory appraisal again.
Yes. Thank you. Yeah. So just to revisit the initial definition. So appraisal in the archival context is how you decide as an archivist what to keep and what to get rid of, right? And it's the primary preoccupation of archival theory is how you make these decisions. And the past 2 centuries of archival theory in the dominant Western mode, and I want to be careful in specifying that because I think every community has its own archival theory. It's just not describing it as such, but in the dominant Western archival mode, almost all of the archival theorists of the past 2 centuries posit that you should not think about future use at all, that you should just be responsible for neutrally documenting what's going on and not think about who might use it and how in the future. You should be impartial to those uses, because you can never predict what somebody might use something for, and that it would introduce an element of bias, right? This is a totally different worldview than I have, right? That it would introduce an element of bias into your collecting activities, right? I think the whole thing is biased from the start, right? So what I posit is liberatory appraisal draws on feminist standpoint epistemologies, feminist standpoint theory, which says that who you are largely determines what you can know and the kinds of questions you can ask, right? So had I not had my own lived experiences, had I not walked by that mural every day, I wouldn't even know to ask the kinds of questions that I'm asking, right? And then furthermore, feminist standpoint epistemology says not only that, but experiences of oppressed or minoritized people are actually have more research value, have more insight, because they're asking the right questions. They're asking questions from a different perspective, from a perspective that upends the dominant power structure, right? So they ask different questions, they notice things differently. They do different kinds of research in service of, ideally in service of, oppressed communities. So after doing all of this reading about feminist standpoint theory and epistemology, I thought, how can I apply this to appraisal, to how we make decisions? Because it's so clear to me that who you are, your experiences determine what you see to be of value in the historic record. What you think we should keep and what you think we should throw away has everything to do with your own experiences and your own worldview. So then I propose something called a feminist standpoint appraisal theory. And I see it as a mode of liberatory appraisal, in which I say that liberatory appraisal has future use, current and future use at its core. So it's collecting records that you think, based on your own experiences, right, can be used for the liberation of oppressed people. And what that means, it has, there's not a single definition of what liberation is, right? And certainly, like, I'm not the one who should be defining what liberation means. And I don't think anybody will ever come up with a single accurate definition of liberation. But for me, what liberatory appraisal means is collecting records that enable the joy of self-recognition for minoritized communities, that joy of saying, I see myself in a record. Some interviews I did a few years ago with users of the South Asian American Digital Archive, a South Asian American historian said when she first encountered Sata, quote, it was like suddenly discovering myself existing, right? That's like an amazing phrase, right? To suddenly discovering yourself, that's joyous. That feels liberatory, right? But then also, I think what I call in the book chrono autonomy, right? To enable communities to develop their own senses of time and their own temporalities and develop archival practices that reflect their own temporalities, that aren't based on this dominant white narrative of it gets better, right? A dominant white linear progress narrative that says, okay, the US was founded on these two foundational sins, but we've moved beyond it. We had the Voter Rights Act, we had a Black president, we're making progress, we're getting closer, right? That is a dominant white temporality, I think. And so we need practices, I think, that enable different kinds of temporality, which I was pointing to with these cyclical histories. And then also, I think, activation of records for material redistribution, right? So for legal claims, for example. But a liberatory appraisal has at its heart both an acknowledgement of the positionality of the person making the decision and the end uses, right? So it's really interesting to think about the relationship between liberatory appraisal and community archives, because any archive could be liberatory and any archive could be oppressive, right? So you could have a government archive, a government repository that is being activated for legal redress, in which case it could be a liberatory archive, right? And you can also have a community-based archive. Like, community is not warm and fuzzy, right? You can have a community-based archive that is excluding people who are marginalized within that community, within the identity that the archive is coalescing around, or that is tied up into respectability politics, in celebrating the FERT, right? So that can be an oppressive archive, right? So there's nothing necessarily inherent about university archives or community archives that makes one oppressive and one liberatory. It's more about the activation and the practices. I hope that answered your question.
It did. Thank you. And so I want to jump to some of the questions that we have coming in. And we have a question here that says, do you have any suggestions for communities that don't have reliable digital or Wi-Fi connections? How would you apply your model of not collecting / stealing local materials while sharing that information with the community?
Okay. So it's interesting, this question of like digital access and digital infrastructure with community archives. So a few years ago, I did some work with Burgess Jules, who works for, it was then called Shift Design, it's now called Shift Collective, looking at how might we encourage community archives to participate in a national digital infrastructure if we were to have one for archival materials. And we had these events throughout the country where community-based archivists came and talked about the challenges of participation in a national digital structure, whether that be the Library of Congress website or the Digital Public Library of America, DPLA. And what we found was that, sure, there are definitely technical infrastructural challenges. A lot of community-based archives just don't have the equipment and the broadband access to digitize materials and put them online. But also we found that there's a real cultural hesitancy to do that because it depends on how the community is defined, right? If the community is defined by a geography, by a particular neighborhood, then perhaps that community archive doesn't want the materials put online where anybody can access them. They want to be able to make sure that whoever is using the materials has a certain intention or is part of the community itself, or isn't going to extract those materials, isn't going to exploit them, isn't going to commercialize them, right? So there's real cultural and historical reasons for not digitizing things and putting them online. But I also think it depends. Like I've seen a lot of beginning community archives saying, oh, we have a digital archive. And then when you ask a question about it, the answer is what they actually have is a Facebook page or Instagram account, which are not digital archives. They're really great for marketing and they're really great for access, but they're corporate owned platforms that will be preserved as long as it makes money for the corporation, right? It's not a community owned platform. So I think it depends again on like what are the specific needs of the community. If the community does want infrastructure and digital infrastructure and to put things online, it takes money, right? Which is part of this advocacy for redistribution of resources. It takes money to do those things. And the current funding structures always benefit the bigger institution over the small community archive. Like when we first started Sata, we initially thought, okay, we just need one huge grant, right? We just need one rich person in Silicon Valley to write us a check, right? And that didn't happen. And when we applied for grants, we got feedback that I think was racist, right? We got feedback that said, this is a niche community, so no one's going to care. No, no one outside of the community is going to care, which is like, full of racist assumptions. When a digital archive is about Walt Whitman, we're all supposed to care, right? But if it's about a minoritized community, then somehow it's niche, right? That's racism. Thankfully, I think the funding landscape has changed, and it's changed because of advocacy, people like Burgess Jules tweeting, picking up the phone, sending emails to funding agencies, letting them know that community archives are important and exist. For us, for Sata, what we wound up doing is actually the most sustainable thing, which is building a really large base of individual donors from within the community who give gifts to Sata, $5 a year, $10 a year, to up to $5,000 a year, $10,000 a year. Last year, there were over 700 people who made gifts to Sata, which is like really important and incredible to me. It says more to me than, a large grant, although we also would certainly not turn down large grants too. And we have gotten more successful at getting them, but only after a really long time of advocating for them. The Mellon Foundation has a program to fund community-based archives. So that's like a tangible place to look for funding. It's unrestricted funding up to $200,000 for community-based archives. And they issue that call every year over the summer.
All right. And so we have two questions that talk about engaging students in this. And one of them is from a student who asked, what is the one thing I can do as a Sewanee student to take action in this work?
Oh, that's such a good question. What is the one thing you can do? I think go into the archives, see what's there, get your hands dirty. Hopefully the archives aren't dirty. Archivists hate when people refer to archives as dusty. They're not dusty. Archivists do their work, they're clean. But go into the archives, look through those boxes and see what you find and see how it relates to what's going on right now, right? So find the resonances in those records, activate those records, learn from them, learn strategies, see what worked, what didn't work, what tactics activists took 50 years ago, 20 years ago, 100 years ago, and what worked and what didn't. Publicize the records, put them in the context of now, blow them up, put them on posters, put them on Instagram, right? Put them on social media, and contextualize them, right? Contextualize them for struggles now, particularly, I think, for reparations. It's such a good question.
Definitely. And we have a question from an archivist who says, how have you seen students, young researchers who are new to archives, get involved with truly activating records instead of just viewing or seeing them as static primary sources?
Yeah, that's a really good question. It's really fun to see students in the archives, and I think a lot of it depends on the kind of assignment, right, that the instructor develops for them, right? So if the assignment is just like, go into the archives and find something, like that's, can often be boring for everybody involved. But if the assignment is go into the archives and find something that relates to an issue that's important to you right now and make a zine out of it, or make a protest sign that references it, then you get that activation, right? So it's the creativity. And I've seen the archivists at UCLA has amazing archivists, and I've seen them do things like that. I've seen them have button makers, where they will Xerox things they'll bring students in. What do you want to copy from the archive? We'll make copies, and then we'll make buttons, political activist buttons about those materials. We'll create zines about them. There was someone stitching a quilt once at one of their events based on something they had found in the archive. So I think activist uses and also artistic uses, ideally the intersection of both of those things, get people involved in the archives and get them to touch things. And then I think also realize that they can make things, that archives are spaces of creativity and debate and discussion, and lively places, right? Places of disagreement, places where the rubber meets the road, right? And to get involved and engaged in that way. A few years ago, Sata had a grant in which we commissioned 5 artists, South Asian American artists, to create new works of art based on materials in the archives. And it was amazing. I have a whole other lecture about that. And my book, actually, read my book, because the intro to the book is about a remix that an artist did of a home video. So a home movie of an interracial marriage between an Indian immigrant student in 1955, in the 1950s, with a white woman in Norman, Oklahoma, at a time when the marriage was actually illegal. And so we have these amazing home movies, footage of this wedding, and then an artist, Zain Alam, who's a musician, remixed the footage, and it was as a silent home movie. He created a soundtrack to the footage, which it's incredibly moving. It's beautiful. But letting students know they can get in there and get their hands dirty and remix things, and copies of things, of course, not the originals, but that it's a space for them, right? It's a space for them and to make meaning and connections with today.
Absolutely. And I have another question here. It says, you mentioned all the wonderful work that Sata has done in liberatory representation and recuperative collecting, but you also mentioned that Sata respects silences of the archive. Could you expound on that?
Yeah, that's a good question. So when we first started Sata, we thought everything we find we'll digitize and put online, right? That was just kind of our policy. But then as we were going, we were realizing that kind of open access for everybody policy doesn't always make sense. So I'll give you an example from the Vaishno Das Bagai collection. So, the video that you saw about Vaishno Das and Kala Bagai. So Vaishno Das Bagai wound up killing himself, right, in protest when his citizenship was revoked. And he left a very public suicide note that Ronnie read from in that video. But he also left a private suicide note that you could tell it was very premeditated. It was typed in red ink across the envelope. It was addressed to his wife, and it said, "For your eyes only, no one else should read this letter." And as an archivist making decisions about what to digitize, I come across this letter. What do I do, right? What do I do with this letter? And I called Ronnie, the granddaughter, and I said, what should I do with this letter? And she said, it's been 100 years, you can digitize it. No, it didn't feel right. It didn't feel right, right? 100 years ago, he clearly premeditatedly expressed a desire that no one else should see this letter. I'm not going to digitize it. I'm not going to be the one to put it online. He could never have conceived of the internet, right? And that it could be made public in that way, but certainly just in the confined boundaries of what he conceived of as public, he didn't want it to be public. So no, right? So respecting that silence. Another example is that we were given access to newsletters from a South Asian lesbian and gay organization from the 1990s, and South Asian American lesbian and gay organization. And like the newsletters are amazing. It's incredible history that we need and we want. But there are people's names in these newsletters and photos of people who are maybe not out to their families. And there are also real consequences, particularly to people who have families in South Asia, of being outed, right? Like violent consequences. And it's impossible at this point to track everybody down, right? And get permission. And so it's very different if they gave consent to be in the newsletter in the 90s in a small newsletter that was Xeroxed, probably someone's like, you know, stolen time after work on a Xerox machine versus you know, being scanned and made available online, right? So we made the decision we're not going to digitize those newsletters, right? We had thought about redacting them, so you know, blocking out the names on a copy of them, but that seemed like to do a form of violence as well, right? That we didn't want to do. Because we're online only, the stakes are kind of lower. Like those newsletters still exist and they were actually deposited, given to a physical repository so someone can go physically and access them. It's not like if we don't digitize them, they're being destroyed, you know, so there is that cushion, I would say, because we're online only. Other things like when the first round of the Sata Creator Fellows, the Dalit activists who are, you know, previously known as like untouchables or lower caste activists, and the trans community members too, not everybody wanted their name associated with their stories. And we had to respect that, right? So it has changed our practices, I think. You know, most archivists, they want the metadata, right? They want to record as many facts as they can about the context of creation, but we've also had to learn like, no, we're not doing that this time.
All right, and I have one last question here. And it asks that you talk about the possibilities and perils embedded in community-driven archives housed in majority white universities when college instructors and students pursue community archiving and history work with community and partners. It says, can colleges not just reinforce the status quo?
Yeah, yes, but I think you have to fight, you have to go against the mainstream, right, in order to do that. So I've just, in my own work, you know, I work at UCLA, it's a massive bureaucracy, right? And I'm not an archivist at UCLA, I'm a professor at UCLA, right? But all of the practices are designed to support these oppressive systems, right? So for example, I have applied for a joint grant that was successfully awarded with Texas After Violence Project, which is a community-based archive that documents victims of state violence in Texas, and South Asian American Digital Archive. So for a collaborative project, if I apply for the grant as UCLA takes 56% off the top of the grant, right? 56% of that grant means nothing to UCLA as an institution, but it effectively triples the budget of the Texas After Violence Project, right? So like figuring out how you're gonna fight against the policies is really hard. And I wanna say, like, in particular, women of color who are archivists who work for predominantly white institutions, I've just seen them bear the burden of doing this kind of work and the exhaustion of constantly fighting against the systems, right, that don't reward the kind of work and the kind of effort and labor that it takes. When you're doing community engaged work, your work is not going to be from 9 to 5, right? You're going to go to funerals and you're going to go to potlucks and you're going to go to all kinds of events. And you're going to hear things that are probably painful about your university at these events too, right? And so it's possible, I think, to do that. It has to be possible to do that kind of work. But it's also exhausting to do that kind of work. So, I really recommend finding communities of support, finding other people who are doing that kind of work, and consciously trying to shift resources towards those, away from the university, towards those communities that can really, really use them. And an acknowledgement that it's not easy to do. One of the things I love about independent community-based archives is that autonomy, which is so hard fought. They're more agile, right? You can respond more quickly. You can do work that actually supports communities. You can quickly reassess if you're doing a practice or have a policy that isn't benefiting the communities you're serving and representing. Whereas, large university bureaucracies are slow and hard. It's hard. I should have ended with something more inspirational than that. Keep at it. We can do it.
Absolutely. All right. Thank you so much, Professor Caswell, for joining us tonight. And I want to say thank you for everyone in attendance for joining us. And I guess that's it. So good night, everybody. I'm so energized after this. I'm so excited to review my notes and everything. So thank you, everyone. Have a good night.
Thank you. I really enjoyed it. Take care.